Welcome to this month's edition of Missouri Legislative Update. I'm Jennifer Yapel reporting for the Missouri Senate. In this program, I'm reporting to you from the floor of the Senate chamber, where 34 members meet to consider some of Missouri's most important measures.
And I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives. Governor Jay Nixon delivered his proposed budget and legislative agenda during his annual State of the State address. In our lead story, we bring you the sights and sounds of the address, as well as what leaders on both sides of the aisle had to say about the governor's primetime speech.
The governor of the state of Missouri now approaches the chamber.
Governor Jay Nixon delivered his annual State of the State address in front of lawmakers, well-wishers, and others as he laid out his legislative agenda and more for the 2013 legislative session. Lawmakers received the speech with raucous cheers and pensive stares. During his primetime address, Nixon also presented the General Assembly with his budget for the upcoming fiscal year.
The majority of the speech was focused primarily on the state's budget and spending, and the budget chairman may or may not have early numbers on this, but I believe that the governor proposed one of the largest, if not the largest, state budget ever. So I have some concerns about that.
The governor's budget calls for funding increases in several areas, including more than $100 million for K-12 education and more than $30 million for higher education. However, these funding increases are based upon the General Assembly passing 4 pieces of legislation to free up new funding sources, a concept the House's top Democrat agrees with.
It's his responsibility to put things in the budget, to put laws in the budget that, quite frankly, need to be passed to balance the budget. He has a responsibility to balance the budget, and he can do that by suggesting ways to do that.
Some of these issues have come up in the past and have not passed. None of them have passed the legislature in the past. I don't know if there's likelihood that they'll pass this year, but that's $164 million.
Nixon also proposed expanding the state's Medicaid rolls by more than 250,000 people. He claims the expansion would be paid for by the federal government through a provision in the Affordable Care Act. However, the speaker has concerns regarding the federal government's willingness to pick up the state's tab.
I heard a lot of spending in the governor's budget tonight, but not how you pay for it long term if, and I don't believe it's an if, I believe it's a when, the federal government starts ratcheting back.
Lawmakers now begin the process of working with the governor's budget to create their own version of the state's 2014 operating budget.
The Missouri Senate advanced several measures to the House during the month of February, ranging from legislation addressing a fund that will compensate those individuals who are injured on the job to a measure designed to keep more revenue in the Show Me State. Senate Bill 1, sponsored by Senator Scott T. Roop of Wentzville, creates a funding mechanism to bolster the second injury fund when usual collections do not meet the fund's demands. Senator Roop says the bill is a compromise several years in the making.
So when you start taking things out, you please one, but you don't please the other. And so I hope that together, when we have a finished product, it's something that works for the state and works for the people.
Senator Scott Sifton of Afton commends the Senate for working together and moving the legislation forward.
It is my hope, because it is so important to all involved, to reach an agreement, that we can do that and truly agree and finally pass something that can earn the governor's signature by the time the process is done.
Legislation that would reinstate local taxes on vehicles bought from other states or sold privately between Missouri citizens also moves to the House. Senators stress how much revenue the state has lost and could ultimately recoup through the passage of Senate Bill 182, sponsored by Senator Mike Kehoe of Jefferson City.
From April of 2012 through December of 2012, between casual sales to each other, and Missouri residents who bought a car out state but then licensed it in the state of Missouri, those cities and counties have suffered $43 million in revenue loss in just those 8 months.
Kansas, as you know, is already engaged in incentive warfare, and it was last year. It just didn't make any sense to me why we would voluntarily give them another arrow to shoot at us.
Senators also delivered to the House a measure that further defines reasons to disqualify individuals for unemployment benefits.
I think this is the right step forward. There's no better way for us to help Missouri businesses than change the definition of misconduct.
However, some colleagues worry about how certain actions taken by individuals outside of the workplace could disqualify them from receiving unemployment benefits if they lose their job.
that if I'm an employee and my employer just finds that some act that I do unrelated to my job or to his place of business, you know where I'm going.
Senate Bill 75, designed to teach children about gun safety and prepare school employees for possible dangerous intruders, also advanced to the House. Sponsored by Senator Dan Brown of Rolla, he says his measure addresses student and school preparedness.
A lot of angels were gone after Sandy Hook, after Colorado. I pray to God that never happens again. And I hope if it happens, that we can respond more effectively and disable that shooter as soon as possible.
Some share their concern about spreading teachers' resources too thin, while others compare the gun safety program in Senate Bill 75 to other widely known prevention programs.
And we know in our areas, in our high poverty, high unemployment areas, there is a lack of the kind of education we really need in some school districts.
I liken your Eddie Eagle program very much to the DARE program when we were going through elementary school, and they said, here's the effects of drugs. This is what it looks like. Don't do them, because it has irreparable consequences for your life.
A bill designating the new bridge on I-70 crossing the Mississippi River from Missouri into Illinois as the Stan Musial Memorial Bridge also received the Senate's final stamp of approval. Lawmakers comment on an amendment that names a portion of I-70 leading up to the Illinois border after a worker who lost his life during construction of the bridge.
Our office has worked with the family in an effort to make sure Andy's memory is honored, and we feel that this measure will provide an appropriate tribute to Andy.
I've been on jobs where folks have been killed, and there's never anything left to show from where they are. I mean, we often forget about them. We take care of their families. A couple years later, it's history. But this will be a monument to this young man and his family that will always be on that bridge.
To see these and other measures filed this legislative session, visit the Missouri Senate website and click on the Senate Bills for 2013 link under the Legislation tab.
The Missouri House approved legislation prompting stark emotions from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. In this next story, we take a look at how a change at the ballot box brought out strong emotions from Democrats and Republicans.
That we do not directly or even...
The Missouri House put its stamp of approval on a proposal changing the way Missourians vote at the ballot box. The proposal requires Missourians to show a photo ID at their polling place before being allowed to cast their vote. Supporters of the ID requirement claim the proposal is all about making sure every vote counts.
We are just trying to let the electorate know we are trying to do what we can to make sure that things are transparent, making sure they're legitimate, making sure every vote counts.
Under the proposal, individuals who do not have a photo ID will be able to receive one for no cost. The proposal contains two parts: a House bill which provides the language necessary for the ID requirement, and a constitutional amendment which would allow the voters the opportunity to change the state's constitution to make the ID requirement legal. However, not everyone agrees with the ID requirement. One Mid-Missouri Democrat claims the requirement plays politics with the ballot box.
But in my opinion, the effect of the legislation is undeniably to make it more difficult for poorer African American women to go in and vote.
My support of this bill has nothing to do with racism. It has everything to do with having such a deep and profound respect of the rule by the people.
Lawmakers approved the proposed constitutional amendment and the enabling legislation with more than 105 yes votes. Both proposals now head to the Senate for consideration.
Issues relating to education are always a top priority for lawmakers. This year, the Senate has discussed and approved measures that could impact K-12 and higher education throughout the state. Senate Communications correspondent Brad Bayshore has more.
Senators recently approved legislation that would address school accreditation for failing school districts. Senate Bill 7, sponsored by Senator David Pierce of Warrensburg, would remove the waiting period between when a school district's accreditation is removed and when the State Board of Education takes over a school. Right now, there is a 2-year waiting period for that process.
That's too long. And we have students who are languishing that need help, and we as a state need to come in and do that.
Senator Jason Holzman of Kansas City says the bill is similar to legislation filed last year to address issues within the Kansas City Public School District. He also expresses a need to look at other social and economic factors when discussing true education reform.
We need to look at why the students are failing, and we need to look at the district in a way that doesn't blame the traditional suspects that the reform agenda wants to blame.
Senate Bill 7 now moves to the House for similar consideration. Other education bills approved by the Senate include Senate Bill 17, a measure that would create the Career and Technical Education Student Protection Act, and Senate Bill 106, a measure that would require schools and professional licensing boards to accept academic credits for military training. The Senate Education Committee heard testimony on legislation aimed at facilitating the needs of gifted students throughout the state. Senator Kurt Schaefer of Columbia sponsors Senate Bill 193, a measure that would establish the Advisory Council on the Education of Gifted and Talented Children and would require the State Board of Education to designate a staff member to oversee gifted education. The bill's sponsor says gifted students are at a high risk of dropping out of school or becoming disengaged and are no different than students at the other end of the education spectrum.
The purpose of our education system should be to make sure that every student maximizes their potential. And we have a population of students that, frankly, up until recently, we haven't even counted.
In the same committee, Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal of University City presented Senate Bill 169, legislation that would require certain financial information to be included in a school district's bond filing paperwork and on a ballot when voters are asked to authorize any bond issuance.
This bill is about transparency. Communities want to make smart decisions.
The Joint Committee on Education, chaired by Senator Pierce, recently released its revised higher education funding model. Directed by legislation approved last year, the Joint Committee is responsible for developing a model for appropriating funds to the state's 13 public higher education institutions.
As we've seen over the years, higher education funding is decreased, and so we're at almost where we were 10 years ago. And so I think one thing that this committee felt was important is to show that higher education funding is underfunded, and this is something that we need to take a look at.
Reporting for the Missouri Senate, I'm Brad Bayshore.
When we come back from break, legislators from both sides of the aisle take time to discuss key issues of the day during a Capitol dialogue with Bob Priddy of the Missourinet. This month, State Senator Eric Schmitt discusses economic development and tax policy.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course.
Welcome to Capitol Dialogue. I'm Bob Priddy from the Missouri Channel and MissouriNet.com. We're glad to have you with us today. We're going to be talking about economic development and the various elements that go into economic development. And our first guest today is Senator Eric Schmitt from Kirkwood. Now, he is the chairman of a committee with a real long name, so I'm going to have to look at my notes to make sure I get it all. He's the chairman of the Jobs, Economic Development, and Local Government Committee of the Missouri Senate. And you have some bills of your own, but your committee also has taken a look at several bills during this legislative session, even early on. Tax credits is one of the big issues, and you're hitting tax credits from several different directions, but it all boils down to reforming the tax credit system, doesn't it?
I think so. It's an important part of what we're going to take on this year. I think when you look at the state's portfolio of what we offer and how we can be most attractive to jobs, we have over 60 of those programs, many of which were created 20, 30 years ago. And I think it's appropriate for us to kind of take a look and recalibrate where we're at, lower some caps, and make sure that we're the most competitive environment possible for that attraction. And so what we've done early on is some incentives that can help grow our economy. To bring big ticket events to our state is something we've done, I think, in a smart way. And then we went through the process just this week, actually, of looking at more of a global package on reform and some other ideas that have come forward that make Missouri a more attractive place.
Some of these tax credits are pretty small, though. Mm-hmm. Would we miss them if they went away entirely?
Well, maybe not on some of them. I think you have to look at these things independently. So on some of them, maybe they served some purpose 20 years ago, but they may not anymore. And so I think the key for us is to constantly be evaluating this and make sure this is a good deal for taxpayers. Ultimately, we all want to grow our economy, and I think that we just have to be smart about how we do it. And this doesn't exist in a vacuum either. I've got other legislation and other committees that deal with our general tax policy and how we can be more competitive and how we compete with other states. And so this debate doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is a really important piece of our economy.
Tax credits, there are 2 or 3 or 4 at the top that are really big, and that's where a lot of the attention is going, isn't it?
Right. There's the 2 biggest programs of what we do. So over the last year, the state authorized over $600 million in tax credits. About half of those come from historic preservation and low-income housing. And so I don't think anybody's suggesting that they're going away entirely. It's just a question of how can we do that in a meaningful way that, for example, with historic preservation tax credits, it's not reasonable to think you can have a hollowed out urban core and be a major metropolitan area. Just the reality of development doesn't suggest that can actually happen. So we're not suggesting that they go away, but the caps have been lowered significantly. I think there's some savings for taxpayers along the way to do other core functions of government, but then also free up maybe an opportunity for some new programs that can grow our economy to move forward as well. So it's this balancing act, and I think that's important. When you're in the legislature, you have to balance a bunch of different things and hopefully get to the better outcome.
Now, even if you put some caps on these, that doesn't mean we're going to see a massive injection of funding available for the state budget right away, does it?
Well, not right away. Sometimes, particularly on how these are actually issued and redeemed, they're done over a period of years. For low-income housing, for example, it's a 10-year stream. And so if you do reform tomorrow, let's say we get that done this year, it does take 3 to 7 years really to start to realize some of the savings.
How predictable are they, though, in terms of when people redeem them? You can't. Most of them, you get a big slug of them one year and perhaps not very many the next year.
Right, and they're all treated a little bit differently. Historic preservation, for example, they are generally redeemed the year after, and it's a 25% credit on the rehabilitation of that building. There's a longer stream for low-income housing, and so each program is a little bit different, but one of the reforms we are looking at is to lessen that stream, that carry forward of when those tax credits can be redeemed, so we have a better idea as we budget each year how much money is available.
I keep hearing through the years that if we keep lowering taxes in one form or another on business, we're going to generate jobs and get that money back. I've never heard anybody that indicates how long this payout is, how long we have to wait to get back the money that we've given up. What's the formula that you use?
Well, I grew up in a very middle-class family in North County. My dad worked 7 days a week and he worked midnights at Anheuser-Busch. And so for him to be able to keep more money in his pocket for us to be able to go on a vacation or do something in the house was significant, and it colored the way that I view the world and tax policy. I didn't grow up in a super wealthy household. This was about middle-class families keeping more of their own money. So that's the perspective that I bring. And so when I talk about tax policy, for me, I think individuals know better how to spend their money than the government, generally speaking. And so, well, I believe that absolutely, but in this context, right now, we do not exist in a vacuum. I'll just give you an example. Kansas, the state of Kansas, has eliminated the income tax that all businesses, all the flow through, all the mom and pops, the small businesses pay to the state of Kansas. And it's an experiment that they're moving forward. And you can argue that they went too quickly, it was a bad idea, you can argue it's the greatest idea in the world, but the fact of the matter is, if we do nothing, there is a fiscal note associated with that too, because businesses are making an educated decision as rational economic actors of, I can save 6% a year if I move across State Line Road. And so for me, you have sort of the philosophical arguments and even very practical issue that we have to deal with in this state. So what I propose is that every business, regardless of how they're organized, if they're a big C Corp or if they're a 5-person accounting firm, that we lower taxes over a 5-year period, reduce that tax liability in half. I think that grows our economy. But that's a debate that we'll have here in the Missouri Senate hopefully this year.
But are there other factors other than taxes that
Yes.
determine whether businesses come to Missouri or whether they expand in Missouri?
Absolutely.
And are we meeting those factors?
Well, I mean, we have, you have transportation issues, you have education issues. So you're right. I mean, this is not the only factor, but it is a very important factor as businesses look to expand and look to grow. And ultimately, as a dad of 3 kids, I want my kids to come back to Missouri. And so that's why I've talked about trade opportunities, having viable airports. These are all things that are part of that decision-making process for businesses.
How do you balance that, though? Balance lowering taxes, but still having enough to meet the needs to attract business in here with infrastructure and other situations?
Well, I think if you make those public policy decisions as elected officials, you have to believe that you're going to really see growth. And so I believe that that is what we would have if Missouri is a more attractive place by way of tax policy. In my view, that expands the tax base. We need more taxpayers, not more taxes, in my view. And so I think if we can bring more people into our state or allow the businesses that are currently here to feel comfortable expanding here, that's an important thing for us to do. But like you said, the tax issue is not, you have regulatory issues, you have legal issues. And just being from the St. Louis area, I can tell you, you used to have 40 of the top 100 companies headquartered in St. Louis. You don't have that anymore. And so I think for us, the airport being connected to the rest of the world, those are all important discussions for us to have too. But tax policy is a really important one for us to have.
Balancing tax policy with economic development and all of the other services the state needs to provide not only to businesses but to the citizens is a very complicated and a tricky situation. And people like the senator here are the ones that we don't pay very much money to strike that delicate balance. Thanks for being with us on Capitol Dialogue.
In our next segment, the MissouriNet's Bob Priddy sits down with one of the General Assembly's newest lawmakers to get his opinion on what the state can do to bring more jobs to Missouri.
Packers, Vikings, Red State, Blue State. We come from different places. Uptown. But when we live united, we create real lasting change in the education, income, and health of our country. Real change won't happen without you. So give, advocate, volunteer, Live United. Sign up at liveunited.org.
We're talking with Representative John Wright, who is from Columbia, also has an address in D-Rocheport, lovely, colorful little town on the Missouri River. Represents parts of 4 counties. That must be kind of a challenge. You're a freshman now, so you're getting into this business of being the legislature, but representing 4 counties, do you have to be kind of careful where you go when you go out in your district?
No, we have a terrific district, Bob. It's district number 47, parts of Boone, Howard, Cooper, and Randolph. And one of the things that's very special about our district is that it really reflects a cross-section of the state as a whole. It includes parts of Columbia, which is a little bit of a bigger town. We're sometimes calling ourselves a city more and more as we continue to grow. Then we include smaller towns and a fairly large section of rural areas. So we face in our district many of the issues that Missourians across the state face.
You're listed as a co-sponsor on several bills in your freshman year in the legislature. Because you're a Democrat, it's kind of hard for a Democrat to take a bill and write it himself all the way through. So it's good to have a Republican on your side that can carry the bill formally through the majority party.
Well, indeed. I mean, I'm a strong believer of the old adage that there's no limit to what you can accomplish in the world if you're willing to allow someone else to take credit for it. And my role here is to support good ideas however I can, whether it's through direct sponsorship, co-sponsorship, suggesting amendments, chatting with colleagues offline about different pieces of legislation that are coming through the pike. And so certainly building relationships with other leaders from around the state is a critical part of that process.
Job creation is one of the big issues for the General Assembly this year. And although you don't have specific job bills on your list here, education is a key factor when it comes to creating jobs in Missouri, and you have a strong background in education. In fact, you have some education bills you're working on. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about education, how that plugs into employment in Missouri.
A healthy education system is the greatest job creator that we can have in a state. When we look at some of the most dynamic economic areas in our country and indeed in the world, we oftentimes think about places like the Silicon Valley. We think about the technology corridor outside of Boston. We look at what's happening with advanced robotics in Pittsburgh and medical devices in Minneapolis. And what we tend to see in these areas is strong investments in institutions that promote job formation through skill development and education. It starts with great institutions of higher learning and research, and over time entrepreneurs purpose that research to commercialize it, start new companies, And then over time, sources of capital come to support those entrepreneurs in building their businesses. And a network effect develops, and that's very powerful. And we are seeing that in different areas within our state, which is very, very exciting. But it's going to require continued commitment on all of our parts to continue to empower our young people with skill formation and the specific types of skills that they're going to need to be very successful in the 21st century.
That gets to my next question. We're talking about a lot of high-tech jobs that we want to create, but somebody has to be well educated to fix the machinery that the high-tech jobs use, or to build the buildings these high-tech jobs use. And we have to have a strong education system for those folks too, don't we?
That's right, Bob. The economy doesn't stand still. And so we can't stand still and be successful, and we need to make sure that we have sound skill formation programs at every level. I believe firmly that because of some of the research, that it makes a lot of sense to start with early childhood education, preparing young children to be successful in elementary school. Goes all the way up into continuing skill formation programs, worker retraining programs that enable our population base to continue to adapt their own skills, to take great advantage of their talents, to adjust to the adjustments that are constantly taking place in our economy.
There are a couple of issues, another issue that people are talking about is a bond issue, and you have your name on a couple of bond issue bills this year, so that the state can kind of catch up on some things that have fallen by the wayside. Do you have some thoughts about what should be in those bond issues? Because there are varying opinions about what should go into a massive bond issue bill. I guess probably everybody wants a little piece of it somewhere.
Sure, it's going to take some time. But first of all, I believe that the infrastructure bond issue that has been proposed is a good idea for Missouri. We haven't had a major infrastructure bond in many years. We just finished paying off the last major infrastructure bond. We sit in the enviable position of having a AAA credit rating at a period of historically low interest rates, which enables us to lock into very attractive long-term financing as a state at attractive rates. And we can use the proceeds from the bond issue to invest in a whole host of projects that have been deferred for many years. We can use those proceeds to invest in the infrastructure at our colleges and universities. We have an opportunity to invest in a new engineering school at the University of Missouri, for example. I think it's a big opportunity for us. We have opportunities to provide important upgrades to our state parks. We have opportunities to invest in our public buildings that have had so much deferred maintenance. All of these things will help stimulate economic activity and address the deferred maintenance in our public buildings at the same time.
Well, you're brand new in the legislature. As we talked to you, you've had about a month and a half of service in the House of Representatives. How much is it different from what you thought it would be, and how much has it met your expectations?
Well, it's a very special place, and I feel and have felt honored every day that I come to sit on this House floor. Decision-making in a legislature works a bit differently from decision-making at many other institutions. But one of the things that's very special about this place is that we sit on the floor and we debate, and members of the public come and go, members of the press are present, and the openness and the transparency of the debate is something that's very special and that I feel a sense of awe about every day that I go to sit on that floor.
We've been talking to Representative John Wright, who is from Central Missouri, and we appreciate you being with us on this edition of Capitol Dialogue.
And that's our show for this month. If you have any questions regarding anything going on in the Missouri House, you can visit our website at www.house.mo.gov. I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives.
And if you have any questions about the legislation that appeared in this program, please visit the Missouri Senate website at www.senate.mo.gov. There you'll find the contact information for the 34 members of the Missouri Senate, as well as a link to the Senate's newsroom website. I'm Jennifer Yapel reporting for the Missouri Senate. Thanks again for watching this month's edition of Missouri Legislative Update. We'll see you next time.